Welcome! Happy Monday! How are you today? My name is Stephanie McCown and I am your host for the show Get Ready With Me and Talk About Stuff. The show in which I do my makeup while I'm talking to you about whatever happens to be on my mind. Before I dive in, today is my son's first day back to face-to-face learning since last March. I'm a little anxious. So far so good. I haven't heard anything from the school. He's been there about 3 hours and I'm just hoping that everything goes well. I think it will. I think probably I am a lot more nervous than he is and he's going to be just fine. Most likely. Yeah, he's going to be fine. So that's where I am today though. That is what is dominating much of my thought process today. However, before all of this, I did spend some time preparing for today's topic, which is the Amityville Horror. But not the way you think. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Amityville Horror itself. I am going to give just a brief history, talk very briefly about what happened, etc., etc., and then we're going to get into the real reason I wanted to talk about this today. Real reasons, I should say. So, the Amityville Horror, the legend has been around for a very long time, so I don't feel like I need to belabor the points regarding everything that happened. Just very briefly, on November 13th, 1974, the entire Defeo family in Amityville, New York, was murdered. They were murdered by none other than Ron Defeo Jr. He went by the nickname Butch, and he just killed his whole damn family. Now, Ron Defeo Jr. said that he had heard voices, and they were telling him to kill his family, and one by one he went through the house and murdered them. Everybody in the family, they were found in the same... What did I just do? Doesn't matter. I'm going to work with this. They were all found in the same position. They had been shot in their sleep, and they were found laying face down. It was more of an execution style killing. And, one thing that I don't know that anybody's ever really explained was how he used a .35 caliber gun and went through the house killing people one by one, and nobody in the family woke up during the killings and nobody in the neighborhood heard the gunshots. Regardless, the end result is the same. His whole family was dead, and Ron Defeo Jr. or Butch Defeo, anyway, he initially, so right after he killed his family, he went to work, and then apparently the neighbors thought it was very suspicious that the house was so quiet. They couldn't understand, they hadn't seen anybody, no activity during the day. They noticed that the dog was not barking. They're like, something's not right here. But as far as I know, nobody went in to investigate until later that day at 6:30 p.m. when Butch went to a nearby bar and said, somebody killed my mom, and people went to investigate and found the whole family dead. They were under the impression that, finding his mom murdered was the first clue that Butch had that something was wrong, and they went in the house and found everybody dead. And I'm assuming, I didn't hear what happened to the dog, but I'm assuming the dog was dead too, which is, of course, why the dog was not barking. But I couldn't find out what happened to the dog, and I really wanted to know. I was so curious. What happened to the dog? Nobody knows. It's the secret of Amityville that's still kept close to their hearts, and nobody's sharing the information, at least as far as I could tell. At any rate, so eventually, though, Ron Defeo did admit to the killings, and he's now serving, I believe it's, 6 life sentences. No hope for parole. He is going to spend the rest of his life in prison. About a year later, the Lutz family moved into the home. They bought the house, George and Kathy Lutz, excuse me, they bought the house for like $88,000. As far as I could, as far as I remember reading, the house was still furnished with the Defeo's furniture, which to my mind, it's like, no, we're not going to keep the belongings of the murdered family in this house. We will be getting new furniture. Thank you very much. But, I guess if you are working on a budget, having the furniture of murdered people is probably it's gonna have to be something you just learn to live with, and try to forget the absolute horror of what happened to the people who once owned that furniture. So George and Kathy Lutz moved in with their children, and they weren't there very long before, according to them, creepy, kooky things started happening. They were experiencing things, and the Defeo murders happened at about 3:15 a.m. And the weird happenings in the Lutz house began, as you might expect. A lot of weird things would happen at 3:15 a.m. But not only at 3:15 a.m., just usually. Just, on average, I guess the spirits were like, hey, you know what? This is when we were murdered. Let's make some noise. And started, giving George and Kathy Lutz all kinds of trouble. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details about this because the details have been shared far and wide for decades now. And I think that, most people know that the Amityville Horror was just a really, really bad thing. And, George and Kathy Lutz had a horrific experience, as did, according to them, their children also experienced these things. They would hear, voices. They would, Kathy Lutz would levitate in her sleep. They would have like this green slimy material appear overnight. They would find it in the morning, like all over their floors and stuff. There would be like black, like oily, gooey stuff oozing down the walls, and just all kinds of really cool things that were happening in this house that earned it the label the most haunted house in America. So George and Kathy Lutz and their family only lasted a mere 28 days in that house, and then they just were like, nah, we're out. They noped out of here, or noped out of there rather, with nothing but what they could carry, and never went back. And they were like, this place is hella haunted. And their story, became quite famous. Interestingly, after they left, George Lutz did send in some friends to retrieve some of their belongings. And the friends, he had told them, just don't spend a lot of time there. It's terrifying in there. You're going to want to get in and get out as quickly as possible, because if you stay too long, terrible things will happen. And, just don't stay. And they were like, okay. So they went in there, and much to their surprise, nothing happened. They didn't have any eerie feelings being there. They didn't hear any voices. They didn't see anything, creepy or unsettling. So they actually sat around for a while and just like drank beer and were like, hey, we're sitting in this supposedly super haunted house and nothing is happening. And it kind of became a joke among some of his friends that, I don't know what they experienced, but when we go in there, nothing happens. It isn't just that small, insignificant things happened. Nothing happened. But that did not deter the Lutzes. Oh, no. So they shared their story with a few people. And in 1977, the book, The Amityville Horror, was released. And to date, it has sold over 10 million copies. I mean, this is a wildly popular legend. And at the time, though, when the book came out, it was something that people just could not they didn't know how to make sense of this. This was like uncharted territory, even though to us, you know, in 2021, you know, the legend of the Amityville Horror and all the gazillion movies that have been made about it, it's kind of like, you know, you know, it's just old news. There's nothing all that fascinating about it anymore because the story has been hashed and rehashed to death. But back then, this was just shocking. This was jarring for people to see these things playing out on screen, seeing this family traumatized and terrorized by unseen entities in their home. And it wasn't just any house. It was a house where 6 people had been murdered by a family member who said that they did it because they heard voices telling them to. So this was like an earth-shattering, like an earth-shaking thing to watch this unfold on the screen, to read about it in the pages of a book. I mean, the movie didn't come out until 1979, but obviously the movie came out, you know, they made a movie about it because the book was so wildly popular. And this was a story that garnered a lot of attention and did earn the house the title, I guess, of the most haunted house in America. Now, paranormal research at the time was still in its infancy. Even though today you can turn on the TV, or do people even watch TV on TVs anymore? I stream everything on my tablet. But anyway, you know, you can look on TV or wherever you do your viewing at any time of day, and, you know, you'll see all kinds of shows about ghost hunting. It is so cliche now, you know, it's so common now, it's almost laughable. I mean, like, you know, some of the shows are so bad and some of them are actually really good, but they're very common. But back then, paranormal research was still very new and there wasn't really an established way of doing things. And that is why people like Ed and Lorraine Warren are so important, and they are part of why I'm doing this video today. So Ed and Lorraine Warren and others decided, hey, we need to investigate this house. And they, along with others, conducted investigations and concluded that this house was, yes, indeed, very haunted. Now, if you were to really dive into how Ed and the Warrens operated, you would see that a lot of what they did was they really played on the fears of the people they were trying to help. And it was no different with George and Kathy Lutz. George and Kathy Lutz said they were terrified of this house. They said that horrible things had happened to their family in this house. So when Ed and Lorraine Warren went in there, you know, of course they were going to find something terrible there. And of course that something terrible they found was going to be demonic. And of course any argument to the contrary would be met with a stern warning that ignoring what the devil is doing in your house is only going to invite further demonic activity. Ed and Lorraine Warren were not great people. And I think it's important to be honest about that, because it's okay to say that they contributed a lot to the beginnings of paranormal research and helped give it credibility. But it's also important to be honest and say that a lot of what they did was played on people's fears. They took something that people were afraid of, and rather than looking for ways to actually help the people and, if possible, debunk what they said they were experiencing, they just kind of took it and ran with it. And even though they didn't charge for their services, they did make a whole lot of money doing lectures, doing guest appearances at what passed for paranormal conventions back in the day, made a lot of money selling books, and all of that stuff was really based on feeding people's fears. Ed and Lorraine Warren had a heavy influence in the beginning of the Satanic Panic. Ed and Lorraine Warren attached significance to things that had no significance. They implied the presence of evil in the most mundane of things. And they faked evidence. I don't know if they faked anything in the Amityville house, but they do. It's on record that they faked some evidence to help build their own credibility with people. And a lot of what they did was convince people that things that were not evil whatsoever, probably not even paranormal whatsoever, were happening to them because of demonic activity. How did that influence the Satanic Panic? The Satanic Panic, in the version of it that I was subjected to, I did not grow up Catholic. Ed and Lorraine Warren are, they're said to be Catholics. There's certainly room for disputing that, but that's a whole other topic. I did not grow up Catholic. I grew up in the Assembly of God Church. So that's a charismatic / Pentecostal church. The version of the Satanic Panic that I was subjected to, I can see the direct link between that and the way Ed and Lorraine Warren conducted themselves in bolstering the perception that they were credible. In the version of the Satanic Panic that I grew up with, demons could come to you through the music you listen to, the books you read, the kind of decor you have in your house. They could come to you through an errant thought that you had in your head that just popped in there. No, it didn't just pop in there. A demon put it there. It could, demons could come to you through movies that you watch. Anything that could even remotely be perceived as being, quote, evil or of the devil, gave Satan, according to what I was taught, an avenue into your life. Well, why did that matter? It mattered because for a lot of people, it created a sense of panic, obviously, hence the name, the Satanic Panic. It created paranoia. It infused them with a sense of constant fear that they were going to do something that invited Satan into their lives. And then what would happen is, everybody has struggles. That's just part of being human. What would end up happening was, people would start having the human experience, and their church leaders would look at the things they've been doing. What books have you been reading? What movies are you watching? Etc., etc. And they would point to things in their lives that they would say acted as a portal or an avenue through which Satan and his minions were able to access their lives. And by engaging in those things, you had essentially given Satan permission to do whatever he wanted to do, because you listened to music that wasn't Christian. So you basically gave Satan a foothold in your life and gave him permission to do whatever he wanted to do. And that's why your life sucks at the moment. It was so dehumanizing of people, because it really took away any sense of autonomy that people might have perceived that they had about their lives. It took away took away any sense of responsibility for their own actions, because they could say, the old Flip Wilson thing, the devil made me do it, which was the original argument that Ron Defeo Jr. used, basically, the devil made me do it. And, as you might know, the Satanic Panic, it had major effects on people's lives. False accusations led some people to incarceration. It destroyed people's livelihoods. It was not just, it's easy to look at it now and think it's kind of humorous that people were so taken in by something that was clearly so false. But at the time it was happening, there was nothing funny about it because people's lives were being turned upside down by these accusations of being involved in satanic activity. I remember growing up in the Assembly of God church, and to hear our church leaders talk, you would think that there were, groups of Satanists all over the city is sacrificing babies and calling on Satan to help them destroy certain people, usually ministers of some kind. I mean, you would think that these were things that were happening everywhere. I remember, when I was younger, my parents let us celebrate Halloween. It was no problem. I mean, it was fun. We would put on costumes and go around the neighborhood and get gobs and gobs of candy. And it was fun. It was just something to do to get free candy. I mean, what's not fun about that? Well, then when we moved to northern Michigan and we started attending the Assembly of God church, things changed. And my parents, in the middle of the Satanic Panic, this would have been late 80s, early 90s when this started for us. Suddenly those things were not okay. And I remember one time my mom yelled at me because I wanted to go out and trick-or-treat on Halloween, and she basically told me that by doing that I was giving approval to the sacrifice of babies. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm not doing that. I just want to go get some candy. But that was what the Satanic Panic did. It put people's fears into overdrive. And Ed and Lorraine Warren, for all of their contributions to the paranormal, investigation of the paranormal, I should say, though they also had a hand in feeding that, because they created this dialogue that said, that benign things are actually evil, and there could be demons in your music, and so on and so forth. They had a direct hand in feeding that paranoia, and they made a lot of money doing it. And that's the part that just, it does more than irritate me. It's infuriating, because they created this whole false narrative about, first of all, what the paranormal is. They assumed that every paranormal thing that was happening, or that they said was happening, was demonic, and they treated it accordingly, and which gave people this idea that every paranormal thing that's happening has ill intentions toward them, and has to be dealt with in the way, Ed and Lorraine Warren as Catholics would deal with it, using the blood of Jesus and so forth, pleading the blood of Jesus over things, and, exorcisms, and, I guess pleading the blood of Jesus is more of a charismatic thing. That's what I grew up with, but it is a direct offshoot of what happened with people like Ed and Lorraine Warren, thinking the only way to counteract paranormal activity was to hold up a crucifix and chant various prayers and whatnot. And it really did a lot of damage, I think, to the paranormal field in general, because it's, to this day, I think people still have, I think it's changing, but I think it's taken a long time to change people's minds about how you approach paranormal investigations and what you do if you do find something, and assuming that what you find is automatically evil and has bad intentions for you, and the only way to counteract those intentions is to whip out the crucifix. I think that's taken a long time for people to realize that's not always the best answer, or even an answer at all. There are other and better ways to approach these things. But that is not something that would have made Ed and Lorraine Warren a lot of money. So that's not what they chose to focus on. And I think it's okay to honor the work that people have done, but we also have to be honest about it. And that brings me to my next point. So as I was, learning more about the Amityville Horror, I did find something that was new information to me. And that is that, now I've not read the book. I've only watched the movie. apparently this is mentioned in the book, but again, I didn't read the book. So apparently it is said, or was said at the time, that the house was built on, I hate even saying it because I'm just gonna use the words that were used back in the day, and in an ancient Indian burial ground. Well, how did they come up with this? It began, the idea began in the book when the author said that someone from the Amityville Historical Society had told them that yes, indeed, the house had been built not on a burial ground, but on grounds used by the Shinnecock. I think I'm saying that correctly. The Shinnecock tribe to corral their elderly and sick and disabled, and essentially leave them exposed to the elements where they would, die of exposure. But they wouldn't use it as a burial ground, according to the book. And this is in the book, it's allegedly coming from an Amityville historian, because they believed that the grounds were just absolutely infested with demons, and they couldn't use it as a burial ground because that would just, that would dishonor their dead and so forth, and probably unleash all kinds of terrible things. So apparently they must have, been more than willing, according to the book, to let their sick die of exposure, but we draw the line at burying them here. That's just uncalled for. So then, Hans Holzer, another, I'm like committing blasphemy today, basically. He is another pioneer in paranormal research. He comes along and he's like, oh yes, indeed, this is indeed built on an ancient Indian burial ground. Not just a place where we let people die from exposure, but they actually buried people here. And then there was a medium by the name of, sorry, I have to consult my notes here. Where is she? A trance medium named Ethel Johnson Myers. She is said to have, in a trance, channeled the spirit of a Shinnecock, again, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, chief, who said, yes, yep, it is one of our burial grounds. You nailed it. Well, as it turned out, that tribe actually lived some 50 miles away from Amityville, and the nearest buried human remains were found a mile away from the house. So they were telling an untruth in order to feed people's fears and get them really excited about this case, and in doing so perpetuated what in the 1970s had become a very common stigma around, it was a common trope that perpetuated a stigma. The common trope was, if bad things are happening, it's because your home or your business or whatever was built on an ancient Indian burial ground. And this was a common thing used in movies, in books. It was like the thing to do in the 70s if you were working in that genre, in the genre of horror. The thing to do was to blame any activity on these indigenous spirits who were angry that you had built something over where they and their ancestors were buried. Now, why is this a problem? Well, in 2021, I really shouldn't have to explain it, and I'm confident that most of my viewers know why this is an issue, but in case you don't, I will tell you. So, in using the trope of the ancient Indian burial ground as a springboard for horrific activity, it reinforced the stigma that indigenous people are, quote, savages. And it also betrayed the anxiety that white suburban America was feeling, in that I don't think they meant to do this, but in using the ancient Indian burial ground trope, what that also said, whether it was intended or not, is that, you know, as people acquired homes, which is it's like the emblem of success in America. You own your own home. You have arrived. This is the thing that people strive for in America, is to be their own person and live life on their own terms. And one symbol of that is you own your own house. You don't rent, you don't give your money to a landlord. You own the home you're living in. And it's a big deal. It remains a big deal today. But in using the ancient Indian burial ground trope, what that also said, intentionally or not, was that there was a lot of anxiety surrounding the notion of ownership, because there is the question that remains still today, and maybe more than ever: whose land are you on? And do you really own the land you're living on? I don't think that was the intention of people when they decided to adopt that trope as like their go-to mechanism for unleashing, violent chaos into their stories. I don't think that was the intention at all, but it's still there, and it still speaks to the fear that if the people who rightfully own most of the land that a lot of us are living on, what would happen? Now, more often than not, what ends up happening is, tribes have taken various entities to court, and in an effort to have treaties recognized and abided by, and sometimes they are successful, sometimes they are not. But this violent uprising that people seem to fear is not even something that, that people want, because this is not, it wouldn't accomplish anything. There are other ways and more forceful ways to enforce treaties and so forth. But it's interesting to me that the trope that was so popular was, if you're experiencing a haunting, check and see if you're living on ancient Indian burial grounds, because what that tells me is that the people of the white suburbia of the 1970s and 80s was not as secure in their place as they wanted people to believe. And I think that also is an acknowledgement, albeit a tacit one, that the land that a lot of us are living on doesn't really belong to us. And we are here because of the tremendous self-control and restraint shown by the people from whom this land was taken. Would it be bad if the indigenous burial grounds really did incite that kind of activity, and if indigenous people decided they were going to avenge their ancestors and they were going to reclaim what's theirs? Absolutely, that would be terrible. I mean, it would be horrific. But that's not what is happening. I read a quote, or not a quote, I read an anecdote, I guess, regarding a conversation with someone from, it was a descendant of people from that tribe that allegedly had buried their ancestors where the Amityville house stands. And this person was saying, it is absolutely offensive, this entire story. First of all, we wouldn't leave our people exposed to the elements to die. That's not what we would do. And secondly, even if it was a burial ground, neither we nor our ancestors would rise up in violence and terrorize people just because we can. I mean, the whole idea is offensive, and it reinforces so much stigma about indigenous people that, we would like to think in 2021 all that stigma is gone because people know better. But I would say that is likely not true. And You know, even though a lot of people do know better, it's, you know, stories like this, even as they're steadily debunked, still, intentionally or not, reinforce, you know, even though this is an old story, just the fact that it is still told, you know, reinforces so many negative stereotypes about Indigenous people. Moving on, another reason why this story just bothers me in so very many ways is because of the thread through the entire story regarding mental illness and violent actions. Now, when Ron Defeo Jr. went to trial, his attorney did try for an insanity plea. He tried an insanity defense, and he said that, you know, he brought in a psychiatrist who said that Ron Defeo Jr. had dissociative personality disorder, or a dissociative disorder. The stigma surrounding dissociative disorder is horrific. To this day, there are still movies and so forth being made that show someone with dissociative disorder who acts violently and murderously. That is a stigma that has not gone away. And even though Ron Defeo Jr.'s attorney was not successful in making that stick, it is still a subtle implication throughout the entire story that the reason, you know, even though Ron Defeo ultimately admitted to the murders, that at least part of the reason why he did what he did was because his mental health made him susceptible to what? To the demonic influences that Ed and Lorraine Warren said were present in the house. And if he had been in a healthier mental state, he would not have been susceptible to those things. Why does this matter? It matters because there is still so much stigma surrounding mental illness. And the assertion that mental illness is in any way demonic is one that unfortunately still exists today. Again, the church that I grew up in, they 100% believed mental illness was demonic. When I was a teenager, not even before I was a teenager, I suffered terribly with depression, and I desperately needed help. I needed, you know, now I can't think of the word. I needed the intervention of a professional to help me because I was really not doing well at all. I was spiraling downward very quickly. My church, their answer was, read your Bible more, pray more. When I finally ended up in the hospital after a very difficult night, during which I finally called a crisis hotline myself and got myself some help, by this time I was in my early 20s, I was hospitalized. My pastor, my youth pastor specifically, came to me and asked me what sin there was in my life that had allowed Satan a foothold to, you know, influence me with this demon of depression. That is why things like this are so damaging. That is why these legends, even after they've been solidly debunked, which the Amityville Horror has been, the Lutz's attorney later admitted it was all a hoax. It has been solidly disproven. It was not real. It was a money-making thing. Nevertheless, because the story became so popular, and because everybody loves a good ghost story, the notion of mental illness and demonic activity being linked it was perpetuated. And certainly the Amityville Horror is not the only story out there that creates and perpetuates this link between mental illness and violent behavior. But when you have people that are considered credible alluding to that as truth, it's a problem. You know, Ed and Lorraine Warren had a hand in creating the Satanic Panic. And I would say they also had a hand in creating the panic surrounding people who are mentally ill. Just because someone is mentally ill, even with something like dissociative disorder or schizophrenia, it doesn't automatically mean they're going to be violent people. That doesn't mean they are people you have to be afraid of. But because of things like the Amityville Horror and all of the credibility initially given to it because of who was involved in investigating it, there is, to this day, a link in the minds of many people between mental illness and demonic activity. Was that the intention of the people involved when they perpetuated this story? And admittedly, they have never, at least to my knowledge, outright said that it was Ron Defeo's mental health that made him susceptible to illness. But you cannot assert that there are evil entities living in the home and there were evil entities responsible for the murders and there were evil entities harassing the Lutz family. And oh, by the way, Ron Defeo has, he's still alive, has antisocial personality disorder. You can't say those two things together without a whole lot of people seeing it as an implication that the mental health struggles that Ron Defeo dealt with made him, you know, those things contributed to how susceptible he was to the influence of the demons that were allegedly there. And it upsets me because, again, in my personal experiences, you know, those assertions had very real consequences for me. I barely made it out of that whole culture that I was part of. You know, I survived only because I finally took the initiative, even though I felt like it was wrong, even though I felt like I was betraying my faith at the time in some way. You know, I took that initiative to get help for myself, apart from everything I'd been told regarding mental health, and it's because of that that I'm still alive. It had nothing to do with my faith saving me or you know, demons finally being cast out of me or anything of that nature. It's because I got professional help. And I got the help that I desperately needed from people who weren't going to blame all my problems on demonic activity because I read a book that wasn't, you know, approved by the church or something. I'll be right back with some final thoughts. I'm just going to go finish this up. All right, I am back. I haven't been doing the fake lashes lately because I just don't have the patience. So here we are. Anyway, so after the Amityville Horror movie came out, you know, and after the Lutzes moved on, actually they moved to California, which I'm sure had nothing at all to do with the fame they hoped to achieve with their story. Anyway, new people did move into the house, and they said that they had no paranormal experiences of any kind there. Nothing like what happened with the Lutzes, or anything even close to that. And every owner since then has said that the only problem with living in that house is the curiosity seekers who come to take pictures. Now, bearing in mind that the Amityville house is on private property, they've done a couple things to, you know, over the years, a couple things have happened to kind of throw people off the trail. The iconic, that's what I'm looking for, the iconic half moon windows or quarter moon windows, the eyes on the house, those have been taken out and rectangular windows were put in. The address of the house has been changed, the house number, hoping to throw people off, but I don't know how successful either of those things have been, although I will say the house looks decidedly less creepy with plain rectangular windows. But, you know, it's been proven that it was a hoax. The most haunted house in America is not haunted whatsoever. And I think all of this speaks to, you know, I'm sure that at least part of what was happening when people went in to investigate was the power of suggestion. They went in expecting to find terrible things, and boy, did they find them. And then, of course, there are people like Ed and Lorraine Warren who made a lot of money just feeding people's fears. They didn't have to prove anything. They didn't have to debunk anything. All they had to do was, you know, find the right formula to feed into whatever fears they were there to investigate, and bingo, you've got a paycheck. And I think it's important to acknowledge you can honor the work done and the contributions made, but it's still important to be honest about the fallout of some of those contributions. And if you look at early paranormal researchers and some of the theories that they had and some of the things they helped perpetuate, we have to be honest enough to say that a lot of those things were racist, they were ableist, they were fear-mongering, they appealed to, you know, the most vulnerable parts of who we are, and instead of finding ways to ease those fears and kind of put them to rest, it was more profitable to feed into those fears and create this environment where you had no control over what was happening to you. And I think that's one reason why the idea of hauntings being demonic activity, I think that's one reason why it became so popular, because, you know, if you have an answer that is not so otherworldly or so beyond human, then, I mean, how are you going to fight against, you know, an alleged evil power in the entire, you know, that exists throughout the entire universe? I mean, how are you going to fight against Satan and his minions? You know, especially if exorcisms and so forth aren't working, what are you left with? And I think that paranormal research has come a long way in that it recognizes the need to help people find closure, more so than just tell people, you know, more so than validating every fear by way of saying, yes, the worst thing that you think you're experiencing, that's it. That's exactly what it is. You know, you can validate what someone is experiencing, but also say, you know, let's see if there is a logical reason for why you're experiencing what you're experiencing, because it very likely is not demonic activity, and it very likely isn't anything that's trying to harm you at all. So I think it's important to honor the work that was done, honor the contributions made, but be honest about the damage those contributions caused, because decades later, that damage is still felt. There are still people whose lives were turned upside down by the assertion that they were involved in satanic things. There are still people whose mental health will never be everything it might have been if they had been given the proper help, because someone believed that their mental state was directly linked to demonic influence. There are still indigenous people who have to live every day, you know, that are living every day in a world that still, maybe without directly saying so, sees them as, quote, savages because of tropes like the ancient Indian burial ground and the violence that ensues when you build something there. And what's interesting about that also is the ancient Indian burial ground trope was not always seen as violent. It's been around for centuries, but at one point in time, it was a call to respect the land that you were, you know, that you were living on, to respect that it didn't belong to you, and you were sharing it basically with the people who were there before you, and you needed to show respect for the land and respect for the fallen indigenous people who were buried there or buried nearby. I don't know what happened to change that, but somewhere along the way it became, you know what, if you're living near an ancient Indian burial ground, and I hate that term, but that's what people use, then you better buckle up, because it's going to get violent. And there are still people who are living under that stereotype that because they're indigenous, that means that they're prone to violence, which isn't true. So at least it's no more true than it is for anyone else. You know, there are people of all races who are prone to violence, and it has nothing to do with their race and everything to do with what kind of person they are. So anyway, I thought that it would be, I thought it was necessary to dive into this because, you know, you might be thinking, Stephanie, it's not even Halloween. Why are you talking about the Amityville Horror and creepy things? First of all, it is always Halloween in my heart. And secondly, it's always the right time to talk about stereotypes and why they don't fit, and to push back against stigma that has harmed people at this point for decades and shows no signs of, you know, slowing down anytime soon. People who are in a mental health crisis, especially if they were raised or are currently in an evangelical community, have to fight hard to be heard and to be, you know, to be seen as, you know, for their crisis to be seen as valid and not something that can just be cured with praying against a demon and reading their Bible more. You know, there are so many reasons why I hate the legend of the Amityville Horror. Most of those reasons have to do with the people who were involved in investigating and the stigma they helped perpetuate. And I can honor their work and their contributions and still say, you know what? You done messed up. And that's what I'm saying. They messed up. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you would like to know more about my life as an evangelical and how I got out of that culture, I do have a book called Razed Evangelical, Losing My Faith, Finding Myself. It is available on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle formats. There are also other ways you can help support future content for this channel. I guess, is this a podcast? I guess it kind of is, because you don't really have to be watching me. You could just listen. Yeah, I guess it's kind of a podcasty thing. And I've also left resources in the description for where I got my information from and places that you can do further reading about the Amityville Horror in terms of the impact it had on culture and various stereotypes it helps perpetuate. Take care of yourselves. Be good to yourself. If you're going out in public, please be safe. Wear a mask. Practice good social distancing. But by all means, stay home when you can, because the only way we're going to get through this is to get through it together and take care of each other. I will talk with you again really soon about God only knows what. We'll see what wanders into my head that I feel I absolutely must investigate and share with you. I will talk with you again later. Bye.